Tonight's meeting is being recorded and it will be posted on YouTube for later reference. And again, for those of you who didn't catch me yesterday, I am Ned Bohman, an outreach coordinator with Great Basin Bird Observatory, and we are a nonprofit based in Reno, Nevada. And we are sort of spearheading this community science effort. And so last night we talked a bit about Pinyon Jay natural history and some of the conservation concerns. And then tonight I'm going to tie that together with the protocol that we have developed for community science. So I am going to start sharing my screen. My Zoom controls are in the way of my PowerPoint controls. There we go.
That looks good.
Okay, so I mentioned we are in a Zoom meeting, not a webinar. So if you are not muted, if you could please mute yourself. And just for your own info, you're on a little small video screen in the corner of everyone's screen. So you have the option to turn off your video if you are so inclined. And I mentioned a minute ago, we'll go through some screen grabs at some point. So it could be useful to follow along with your app or on the Hub site or however works for you. And that QR code right there goes to the homepage of the Hub website where you can follow along. So yesterday I had these grand visions of lengthy discourse with everyone chiming in from their experience, volunteering and surveying from all over. And I can understand reluctancy to do that on this big Zoom meeting. So I just want to make sure that everyone here gets the most they can out of these sessions. The goal was to encourage asking questions. And so I hope I'm correctly interpreting the relative lack of questions last night to mean there weren't any, and the material was covered very well. But in case I did rush through anything yesterday or you're confused about anything, please do speak up or chat or whichever. But I find that I pretty much live and breathe Pinyon Jay lately, so I sometimes forget the need to explain things a little more in depth. And so this evening, feel free to interject with questions, and maybe John can help me with that because I can't really see the Zoom controls when I've got my PowerPoint share up. So if you've got questions along the way, it might make more sense to interject just because a lot of this stuff is kind of step by step. And I don't want it to get lost in the mix if you wait till the end. So I guess just to quickly reiterate from yesterday, we have the Pinyon Jay, a rapidly declining songbird with a very complex life history that makes them difficult to study with standard methods. The scale at which they use the landscape further complicates the picture. The current causes for this decline are not well understood. So without getting into all the stuff we did last night again, basically there's been a lot of targeted effort at developing protocols to learn how to gather.
The 80s, folks. The old record was set back in 1989 of 98. So we're 1 degree above that. How about that? Yes, history made today. Let's show you what's going on out there. And you can see, well, a lot.
Thank you. So there's been a lot of effort targeted at gathering all of the information that we need to communicate to landowners to act on behalf of Pinyon Jay conservation. So I'm going to explain that protocol now, which was developed by the Partners in Flight Working Group, the Pinyon Jay Working Group, which was formed in 2017 and GBBO has been heavily involved with. And they have developed a few different protocols. And this one is designed to be a little more flexible and opportunistic with potential to fill in some of the gaps between other survey methods or other protocols rather. But it does adhere to those same data standards that were developed for the other protocols, as in we're collecting the same types of information. And so the two other protocols being implemented are randomized landscape level surveys and project level surveys for specific applications, development, pinyon juniper treatments, that kind of thing. And this Community science protocol can fill in some of those gaps left by randomized locations and specifically selected sites. So there are strengths to each, and each was designed for a specific purpose. But the community science is sort of an extension of those landscape level protocols. And you can do this either opportunistically or in a more systematic way, where you can submit a record when you come upon jays, or you can actually do this in a more targeted way by identifying areas which you think might be used by pinyon jays, and go in there and recording information, whether or not you see pinyon jays, on their absence as well as their presence. And for those absence records, which I'll talk more about throughout, but we're looking for at least 10 minutes at that location to qualify as an absence. So basically, it's a protocol designed to be easy to encourage more data collection, but it can be as complex as you make it. You can enter a full-on behavioral analysis in that comments field if you're so inclined. Once you find pinyon jays, sit with them as long as they'll let you, and just observe and watch and record all that in the comments. Cover yourself in blind material and show up at a location you've seen them visit before, in hopes that they'll come closer and you can get more observation. So it really is designed to be used in such a way that really suits your needs. Whatever you're feeling, you can really adjust this protocol to suit your situation. And so with these gaps I refer to in the data collection, it's not really information gaps as much in that with landscape level protocol and randomized survey locations, and these are specifically selective. So there's inherently going to be gaps with randomized effort. These can be done a little more systematically. So basically, eBird isn't well suited for this task because of the complex natural history of pinyon jays, where most eBird points are actually birds flying over, not really using the landscape at that specific location, or they're of birds calling in the distance, which again are not using the habitat at that specific location. So it can be difficult to infer that habitat specificity from eBird data because of those factors. But in addition to that key of linking the behavior with the on the ground locations, right? That's going to be the information we need to communicate to land managers, where they are using this specific habitat type for these specific behaviors. And it's important to protect that for these reasons. But also the rigor of the absence data with this protocol is another thing not well addressed by eBird. You can't necessarily interpret the lack of a point on eBird as absence of birds. So the absence points in this protocol are actually systematic and meaningful. And as they accumulate, they can inform habitats or locations not being used, or seasonal use of habitats or locations, as opposed to the absence of the eBird point, which doesn't necessarily mean an absence of birds. It's more likely an absence of observers. So by accumulating more and more of these absence points, we can help fill in this picture a little bit more. And obviously, presence points that have the behavior info is a strength not necessarily captured by eBird. Sometimes people put comments, and that's great, but that is incredibly uncommon in my experience. So with this protocol, we actually require those comments. And the process is really basically as simple as outlined here. You select one of these options from the first field in your survey 1, 2, 3 form and follow the prompts. So there's presence records, sightings of pinyon jays, absence records. I covered 10 minutes in pinyon jay habitat. So this can cover, it's situational. Again, my experience is very Great Basin centric. I was going to say, if you can see a pinyon pine, you're likely in habitat. Although I recognize parts in the north of their range where juniper, 100% juniper stands suits them as habitat. So this is situational, but it's not going to be the parking lot at Costco. It's not going to be that kind of thing. So you know where to expect to see pinyon jays, and this is just going to vary depending on your region. But I covered a lot of their habitats yesterday, and I think you can recall from that and sort of deduce what's applicable in your region. And then lastly, we have test records that you can enter just for practice using the app, and those will not populate on the map. The one thing not captured by the prompt in the data collection process is any additional specific habitat information. And that's because for now, at least, that's a little bit abstract, or at least we don't know which specific variables to be collecting data on. And we're learning, and these forms are informing that. So your observations on this can be very helpful to that end. So in that comments field, one of the more useful things you can include is the specifics of the habitat type you are in, as well as photos, which I'll get to later as well. And so basically, I'm just going to go through the collect data tab on the website and walk you through how one collects this data. So you can get to it through that URL. That QR code looks like it might be cut off, but it's linked to from our homepage of our website as well. And so to get started, you have to sign up for a user account. This is free. But it's required to access the data collection forms. And if you already have one of these ArcGIS online accounts, you sign in. Then after you've done that, you must reach out to us and let us know that you would like to be added to a team. Otherwise, we don't know which team to put you on, or even to put you on a team in the first place. Another thing to include when you contact us is your affiliation. Remember, this is a large scale effort taking place in most Western states at this point. So there's people from all over the place, and there are a dozen or more affiliated groups. So when you create a new username, add a suffix from that organization to the end of your username. For example, I'm GBBO, Great Basin Bird Observatory. That would be the suffix for my team. If you're Audubon Southwest or Lahana.
Ned, we've got a hand up from Amy Whipple, so let's take a break for that question.
I am taking you at your word about chiming in. And just because we have a lot of students here from NAU and Navajo Technical University, I just wanted to mention that I believe John set us up with a NTU NAU group. So those folks can, so when you all sign up, that's what you can let John know.
Yep. John, or send the email to the outreach address there, and either Ned or I will take care of you and get you put into the right group. Yep.
Great. Thanks.
Hey, could I interrupt again? This is Philip.
Yeah, sure.
So so if you're in Colorado and you're part of Colorado Field Ornithologists, or that could be your tagline at the end, CFO. Is that
exactly?
Right? So
and there is a Durango Bird Club
CFO.
and a couple other Colorado groups as well.
Yeah, and what it oftentimes what Philip specifically referring to everyone is that members of a team can sometimes agree to choose usernames when you sign up that end in a common, tag like CFO. So Philip _CFO. And the reason for doing that, it's not strictly necessary, but it helps us keep track. It's one way to help keep track of what data is coming from what group. So it just helps keeps things a little more organized.
Yeah, and we'll get questions from certain group leaders or coordinators about the number of volunteers they have or the number of records that have been submitted. And so if you set your username up that way, it just makes it a lot easier to sort through that data and get that information easily. And so like John said, not specifically required, just can be very useful. And we can also set these teams up to have admin roles on them if desired. I mean, by default, we at GBBO are doing this, but any member of a group can be elevated to a group manager status. And we can talk about that on an individual basis if that's something that you'd like to be more involved in. But so the data collection forms are only available to you once you're on a team. And again, we won't know to put you on a team unless you tell us which one to put you on. So then once you are on a team and you have the app downloaded and the form downloaded, you are ready to collect data. And we have some resources on the GBBO Hub website to guide this. Part one that talks about the specifics of how to install the app and download the form and all of this. And part two that talks a little bit about how to survey and where to survey. And the where to survey for that is a little bit, it's not a little bit, it's totally Nevada centric. So for groups in other areas, probably best to rely on your group lead / coordinator, organizer for that kind of information. We can put that together fairly easily for local stuff in Nevada, given our region of expertise, but it's probably easier for other group leads to do that for their team members.
And it's one of our goals in the relatively near future to make that to broaden the perspective of that part 2 of that survey manual to include all the areas that are participating. So we'll probably be picking some of you guys' ears for suggestions about how to provide that information in specific regions.
Yes, I think that would be a great thing to include in there, especially as the project continues to grow and spread to new areas with new groups finding out about it through different channels, and making that information available so everyone's on the same page is going to be one of the sort of growing roles of the hub, where we see the hub as sort of this central headquarters where you go for all things Pinyon Jay, basically, where it's not just you go there to sign up and never go again, where the idea is for it to actually be engaging and worthwhile to revisit and learn things about what other groups are doing or what other members of your group are doing, and that kind of thing. So if there's specific things you'd like to see, like John was sort of getting at, you can talk to us on an individual basis about that, and we can work with you. But so when you're out in the field, filling out a survey form, collecting data, it looks like this on your screen. And so it's called the Pinyon Jay Community Science Field Survey Form. So make sure that's and the icon on that is a photo of one of our group training sessions. So just make sure you're accessing the right form. And if you're unable to access this, there's a number of reasons, and you contact us and we'll sort you out. But your name and credentials are automatically associated with the record in your account on your device. The other survey fields will not necessarily appear unless you select presence or test record. When you select an absence record, you don't have the options to select for flock size and behavior because you're not looking at birds. And so I mentioned you can do this opportunistically if you just happen to find Pinyon Jays, or you can do this in a more systematic way in which you're actually targeting areas to go look for Pinyon Jays, or you have another activity that you're doing, and you do this while you're doing that other activity. But it's set up to be flexible and to accommodate multiple situations. And so just again, to emphasize the importance of these absence records, while obviously presence records and bird behavior is the goal of the project, to link those behaviors with habitat types, the accumulation of these absence points is also very valuable to inform patterns of landscape use. What they're not using at what times of year is very useful to land managers and conservation. And that's one of the strengths of this protocol, is the rigor of those absence points, basically the amount of faith you can place in those absence records. And then after you select that presence or test record, you estimate the flock size to the best of your ability. And this is the number of birds you see, not the number of birds your experience looking at Pinyon Jays leads you to believe might be there. So, and sometimes you wait till the birds flush to get an accurate count of them flying. Don't charge through and flush them for that purpose, of course, but wait and observe until they leave of their own accord, or if you see them flying to a roost site at the end of the day. You can time your surveys in such a way as to get accurate flock counts, but not necessarily hugely important. The behavior type is really the emphasis here. And so you can select multiple behavior types, as in more than one option of those that are presented there. And then of course you can use the comments section if what you're looking to say about the birds is not one of our preset options. The comments field is for that reason. Next, as you're going through and filling out the form, we ask for the distance to the flock. And this is distance in meters, yards if you're more familiar. It's close enough for our purposes. We don't have to be exact here. Enter 0 if you're in the middle of the flock location, and 999 if you're not sure. So this is going to be birds that are far away that you can't estimate a distance to, distant flyovers, auditory detections. These are those observations that are not as useful as other records. Not to say to not record that information, because it's still good to know that the birds are in the area, but it's not the most useful information that this data form can collect. So when you're estimating that distance, just distance to the center of the flock, sort of think about the landscape features they're using and the distribution of the majority of the birds around the features being used. But don't get hung up in the details. The distance is not the emphasis here. And below this, you have basically the end of the form. You have the comments field and you have the photo options. You can upload up to 4 photos. We strongly encourage people to submit photos. It's great to inform us what the habitat looks like on the ground. This is much easier to glean from photos directly submitted with the record than from looking at satellite imagery or GIS layers later on. So those habitat photos are very useful to us. But also those photo fields can be used if you don't feel like typing out all the comments of what you're seeing and observing in that little box, and you hate typing on your phone as much as I do. Scribble all of that in your notebook and take a photo of your notebook pages and upload those notes. We may contact you to translate depending on handwriting, but if you don't feel like typing all that in the comments field, that's a great way to get more information to us without killing your eyes and your fingers on your little phone screen. But things in the comments that are useful to talk about are sort of the density of the pinyon juniper, right? Was it sparse phase 1, 2, 3? Was there ponderosa? Was there limber pine? How high up were you? Was it mostly sagebrush? Was there creosote next to it? Was it grassland next to it? Was there more pinyon than juniper? Was there more juniper than pinyon? Was it all juniper? Things like that, burned areas, things that we didn't prompt you for in the form that are not necessarily that there won't necessarily be an answer for in every situation, but sometimes there will be something to say about these. And that's what that comments field is for. And so I guess one frequent question we get is how often to start a new form. And the answer to that is really situational. And our stance is sort of evolving as we become more informed about what this looks like. But basically, consider the information being submitted with each form. If nothing new is being communicated, multiple records in quick succession are not hugely necessary to us. But significant changes in habitat or behavior are good basic rules of thumb to start a new form. For example, the birds moved from harvesting caches in trees to harvesting caches on the ground, or they were foraging in trees and then they flew out into the sagebrush. Things like that. So it's very situational, and I'm happy to take questions and get into more specifics of that. But just because that's a very common question, I just figure I'll put that basic rule of thumb out there that significant changes in habitat or behavior are good general rules of thumb for when to start a new form. And we talked about so that's the form. It's really as simple as that, filling out those prompts, and then with the comments field, it can be as much or as little as you want it to be, as involved or as basic as you are inclined to do at the moment, given what else is going on. And so since we talked about these specific behavior types, I mentioned it probably a little bit in the natural history last night, but just to sort of key in on some of these behaviors and some things to look for, I figured I would talk a little bit more about these. And so obviously there's much nuance to the whens and the whys of these behaviors. And I'm happy to try to take specific questions on that, but I'm mostly focusing on how to identify the key behaviors. So how do you know when birds are foraging versus caching? And so foraging on fresh nuts that they're actually eating right then and there, foraging on arthropods that they're bringing back to the nest. Pinyon jays, their main source is pinyon pine nuts, but they will also eat other pine nuts and juniper berries, and they will forage on the ground for arthropods like I just mentioned. And these foraging sites can be significant distances from caching locations. So the foraging is potentially more edge oriented, but there's likely much variation in this, sort of depending how productive the pines are that year and how the cones are distributed on the landscape, if they're upslope on steeper pitches that have retained more water or that kind of thing. But the ground foraging is particularly prevalent in the breeding season when they're provisioning the young with invertebrate, sorry. So just sort of being mindful of the birds on the ground could be foraging. They could also be retrieving cache sites. And it's not always easy to see when the birds are transporting the nuts, when they're actually caching versus just eating them. So I guess just taking care to really watch and see what the birds are doing. So like I said, it's not always easy to see them transporting those nuts. The cache sites, these are mainly in this sort of transitional edge habitat, grassland, shrubland, and this may be related to their spatial memories being better suited to open areas. But regardless of the reasons, this is the pattern we see. And so when you're seeing birds on the ground, they're quite likely retrieving caches, but again, you don't rule out that they're foraging for arthropods until you actually see them probing their bill deep into the substrate to get a seed or place a seed. But for caching or retrieving caches, we're viewing that as the same in this protocol. So basically visiting a cache site, whether they're placing a nut there or retrieving a cache, we're not differentiating for these purposes. And oftentimes this just looks at pecking at the ground or pecking at the cliffside. I've seen them cache in crevices in the bark of trees or cliffs. And when a lot of the ground caches I've observed, this is just my personal observation, and this may again be Nevada centric, Great Basin centric, but I do feel like there's a trend towards caching on south facing slopes and sandy substrates and areas where there's less shrub coverage, basically situations that are going to be less likely to be covered in snow in the winter months. So I guess just kind of thinking about the location where it's happening and how that could inform what behavior is actually occurring. Roosting, this is birds perched in trees overnight, early in the morning or at sunset is when you'll observe them doing this. Basically, what our information suggests is that this happens in denser, higher elevation sites, which makes sense. There's more cover, more protection for the birds. But these sites can be a good distance from the day's last foraging site, distances up to 1 to 3 miles or even further. And they typically don't roost where they were last foraging. There typically is a big communal flight from the day's last foraging site to the roost. And this is a good time to get accurate flock counts. If there's maybe a group of birds nearby that you occasionally observe, but you don't know how many are there, you can time your visits at sunset to sort of try to get at some of this information. I know when I was doing some of the radio telemetry on these birds, I would try to time my visits throughout different hours of the day to get that sort of daily activity pattern, what they were doing at different times, but then to identify likely roost sites and then try to find if the birds were using those roost sites that I suspected them to or otherwise. But again, they do this, they typically fly in one big group to the roost site in the evening, and they typically leave the roost site in the morning as one big group, and they don't necessarily forage right near the roost site. They typically do travel a good distance to these sites. Nesting is another behavior we have identified on the form. And so like I said yesterday, these are not targeted nesting surveys, but it's just a behavior to be aware of and look out for. And the sites where we find colonies in the Great Basin are again denser cover than what we see at caching and foraging sites. And the nests are typically in pinyon pines, junipers, or ponderosa / Jeffrey pine in the Reno area anyway. But the birds are notoriously quiet at nesting sites. It's remarkably easy to walk through and not realize you're at a nesting site. The bird will let you get remarkably close before she'll flush from the nest. And anytime a bird flushes at super close range like that is a good indication that there's a nest nearby. But during the nesting season, males will form their own foraging flocks in return to provision the females. Potentially young females, non-breeding individuals are part of these foraging parties as well. But looking for noticing groups of these smaller groups of individuals is good evidence of a nearby colony. They'll typically be in family groups provisioning their own nests. Like I mentioned yesterday, cooperative breeding is and has been documented in Pinyon Jays. And so they form these family groups during the breeding season, which all combine to form the larger flock. But typically the family groups are doing more of their own thing, looking out for their own nest during the breeding season. So seeing these groups of smaller individuals moving about is good evidence that nesting is happening somewhere nearby. And their nests are these messy stick nests like you see in the photo there. I'm not sure if you actually can see in the photo there, or if you can even see my cursor. But in the crotch of that tree on the left side there is a Pinyon Jay nest, which is larger than you might think for a bird that size and definitely messy. So that's sort of your search image or what have you for what the nest looks like. And again, the nest spacing, like I talked about yesterday, is apparently very variable throughout the range. What we had learned from the Great Basin was that the nests will be every few meters, maybe not every tree, but maybe every couple trees within sort of a smaller portion of the home range. But what we've been observing in some of our surveys in Arizona, for example, is that these nests are less clustered and they're more evenly distributed across the entire home range. So that sort of gets at some of that regional variation that we can really document in a meaningful way with these community science surveys. The last behavior type we've identified on the form is perching or loafing, basically resting when birds are, and not at a roosting site, because that's roosting. So if they're resting during the day after foraging or what have you, if they're otherwise not engaged in foraging or caching behaviors, if they're just sort of hanging out, that's what we refer to as loafing. And that occurs in a variety of habitat types and is likely not as specific to a certain habitat type as some of the other behaviors that they engage in. And so if no one else has any questions, that was what I intended to talk through tonight, is sort of those nuts and bolts of data collection that maybe stimulated some questions and specific thoughts in specific situations. And so I do apologize if this logo off of this thing. The growing snowballing effort. Hopefully we'll have enough people that I can't even fit them all there. So again, if you have any questions, I am happy to take those now. And there's a lot of resources. That QR code goes to the hub. There's a lot of stuff on there. You can learn more background, more natural history. And yeah, if there's any questions, I'm happy to chat.
Hi, Ned. This is Steve. I teach at Navajo Tech University. I was wondering about the nesting sites. Are they located in basically steeper ravines, or is there some proximity within the ravine that they may be located, if they are located in ravines, and also proximity to perennial streams? Thank you.
Yeah, good questions. So ravines are definitely likely sites. Again, I think their nesting site selection is incredibly variable and opportunistic based on the characters of the landscape around them. If there's a steep slope that with dense trees that offers good cover, I think that's quite a likely site for them to choose. But perhaps there's something else available to them that offers more cover that's more favorable. And so I guess to answer your question, sort of yes, but sort of we don't know. And I guess that's what we're trying to get at with these forms, is that we have an idea of where these things occur, but we're also learning that it's different in different areas of the bird's range. And so you guys getting out there and basically on the ground figuring this stuff out is gonna help us answer these questions. And so as in your question about perennial streams, I haven't necessarily noticed any strong affiliation with that, but there's also not a lot of perennial streams throughout Nevada. And so I suspect again that this is just variable depending on the landscape around them. And if they're in an area where that's favorable, I suspect they'd take advantage of it. But I've definitely seen several colonies that were nowhere near any sort of perennial water. So it's by no means necessity for their nesting sites.
So Ned, I had put this into the chat, but what happens if you have no connectivity? Will the data be saved that you enter?
Yes, good question. I should have paid you to ask that question, Phil, because the app is really targeted for that. So it's designed to, it basically assumes you're not going to have access to an internet connection when you're collecting data. So what it does is it saves it in an outbox. And then when you return to reception or Wi-Fi, you can submit those records.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure.
So maybe I missed something, but I was just wondering. I mean, it would seem to me that Pinyon Jays or Pinyons are fairly year-round in the Great Basin, but I was just wondering if they engage, if the specific flocks engage in any kind of migration from higher to lower altitudes, from breeding season to non-breeding, within the Great Basin, or if they would more or less stay in the same habitat year-round.
Yeah, so I think largely they stick in the same habitat year round. I think their movements aren't really driven like most of our other songbirds move. Their movements are largely driven by food availability. So they'll be harvesting in the fall and they'll be seeking out areas of sort of rich cone productivity in the fall to harvest from, and they'll cache, we figure, relatively nearby to those. And so it would follow that they sort of winter where they're able to cache, and that where they're able to cache is sort of related to where they're able to forage. By and large, they stick to one home range, and they're able to complete their full life cycle for their entire lives in one home range for the most part. But there are these nomadic wanderings, and there are dynamics with flocks splitting up. So there's a lot of this stuff that we really don't have a great in-depth understanding of. But they're not migratory in the typical sense like you're referring to, not even altitudinally.
All right, that makes sense. Yeah.
Sure.
Ned, this is Steve again.
Yeah, sure.
Another question I have, I don't really like writing when I'm out in the field. I've done it before when I was a field biologist, but I'm not, that's not one of my choice. But would it be appropriate to take a little digital recorder out there and record your latitude, longitude, and elevation, and then verbally explain where you are and what you're seeing, and then later transcribe that into your notebook or into the app?
Yeah, that's definitely an option. Obviously, just if you're dictating to a recorder, do it quietly so you're not disturbing the birds. But then also just make sure to start that form in the field so that it's geo-referenced, because that's sort of the key of this, is that whenever you start one of these forms, it logs that location, and that location is very important to us to be able to make those behavioral associations. So if you are recording yourself and updating it later, just make sure you're putting the right recording with the right form that you started, and just being careful not to get that kind of thing mixed up with the wrong locations, if that makes sense.
And that sort of gets at something that is, we have some of you have heard a little bit about this, but we have a list of sort of second generation enhancements that we want to implement on the hub site. And one of those is an online form to allow people to go in and enter old records that they may have recorded some other way, in a notebook, using a GPS, et cetera, and then those will become part of the bigger data set. So that's not quite there yet, but it is in the works, and we'll announce it through the hub site when it is available. So if you have, if you find yourself seeing Pinyon Jay somewhere and you don't have your phone with you, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to write down the relevant information, get the coordinates with your GPS, and then later go back and use that online form to submit the record that way. So that is in the works for the fairly near future.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I do see a question from Darren about elevation. And yeah, elevation is great to record, but again, these forms are geo-referenced, and we're typically able to get that from the location after you've submitted the form. But not a bad idea to always more information is helpful. If you're ever in doubt about including something, throw it in there and it can't hurt.
Another question, are these birds, I'm assuming are they territorial? And if there is a little dispute about the territory, what does that behavior look like? Thank you.
So they're not super territorial, only really in the immediate vicinity of the nest site. So territorial interactions are pretty rare with pinyon jays. It's actually not a behavior that I've ever observed. And being that they are colonial nesters, they're used to being in, and they're so social, they're used to being in fairly close proximity to each other. So one would kind of follow that they have sort of a higher tolerance for that kind of thing.
Yeah, and even though the individuals aren't territorial in the way that we think of many other birds being territorial, it might be reasonable to think of flocks as being potentially that way, because we really don't have any indication that different pinyon jay flocks share the same space, whether that's just because they're so spread out or because they sort of actively exclude other flocks from their territory. I don't think anybody really knows for sure, but there really is not much evidence that two different flocks will use the same part of the landscape. So flocks are at least spaced out in a territorial looking way, whatever the actual reason for that spacing might be.
Right. And so again, you're asking great questions that are really getting at a lot of the purpose of this effort is that. And so I sort of apologize if I don't have great answers for these questions, but I think that sort of underpins the whole point here, is that we're all helping to figure all this out together.
I just have a question.
Sure.
Do the pinyon jay birds have like their behavior? Do they change a lot in the elevation? On lower or higher elevation?
Yeah, well, so we've sort of determined that they're very habitat specific in their behaviors. So a lot of their behavior is driven by, well, opportunism and resources. So when they're up at higher elevations, for example, this winter we've had a lot of reports of birds up in higher coniferous habitat, limber pine, for example. And this is sort of just a factor of resource availability, that this year there was such a remarkably poor pinyon nut crop that the birds were sort of pushed, if you will, into other areas to seek out these food resources. So I'm not 100% sure if that answers your question, but basically, yes, they are differentiating their behavior loosely by elevation. And so some of these caching behaviors are typically occurring lower elevation than nesting behaviors, for example, which is potentially a factor of the density of the trees at that given location. So it's sort of related that way, if that gets at your question, I think.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have another question, Ned. You said yesterday that pinyon jays are starting to use feeders more and more. I was wondering if different flocks are utilizing the same feeders, and also if they seem to tolerate each other in utilizing these. Thank you.
I don't really know. I don't have a good feel for what the dynamics are around feeder use. One of our newer partners on the project in Central Oregon has actually quite a bit of data on birds using feeders in that kind of a setting. And so I'm really looking forward to him uploading some of that older data to flesh out that picture a little more. But I don't really know. I think it really depends on the availability of pine nuts in the area, to the extent that they're really driven to use feeders, and then also the abundance of feeders in a given area, if there's really going to be that much competition for a given feeder, or if they're able to spread out in that way. So I unfortunately don't have a great answer for you.
A couple of questions came into the chat, Ned. Somebody asked if they if you've ever seen Pinyon Jays in mixed flocks with other birds, particularly in the winter or hanging around with other species.
Yeah, not in the typical sense of a mixed species flock. You'll sometimes see flickers and hairy woodpeckers mixed in with Pinyon Jays. And I'm not really sure to interpret that as really associating in sort of the safety in numbers sense of a typical mixed flock, or if that's more just a factor of available resources. But potentially birds drawn to Pinyon Jays caching, aware that Pinyon Jays are caching and potentially looking for those resources. But not in the typical sense of a mixed flock. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, John.
I haven't seen anything that you'd call a mixed flock. They're sometimes co-occur in similar areas,
Right.
with some other birds hanging around, but not really in a coherent flock. Got another question about whether or not there's competition for pinyon pine seeds with other species, particularly in a good year. And I think my answer to that is that in a really good year, the competition is lessened because there's so many seeds to go around. But in a poorer year, there probably is a great deal of competition for pinyon pine seeds between pinyon jays, some of the small mammals that will eat them, some of the other birds that will eat them, even though they might not be as good at opening the cones, they'll still do what they can. So Ned, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
Oh, I was just going to add about their adaptations with their sort of naked base of the bill kind of gives them a leg up on some of that competition, where they're actually able to get into those cones when they're fresher and covered in resin. So they sort of get a jump on some of the other potential competitors for nuts and cones. But yeah, basically like John said, in a year with an abundance of nuts, probably not, but in a year with a paucity of cones and nuts, likely significant competition.
I see one hand up from Philip again.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So it may be too early to tell, but are we seeing any migration of the pinyon jays away from pinyons? Are they going to nesting in other trees? I know that I think in Colorado on the east slope, we saw them in different pine trees, spruce trees.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fair to say that, and I don't know if you call it migration, but certainly pinyon jays in certain areas, and especially some of the areas that are more on the periphery of the geographical range, will use trees that are not typical of the core part of the range, right? So, there are pinyon jays in Oregon and southern Idaho that are simply not using pinyon pines because there are no pinyon pines there. So, I wouldn't call that migration, but you would call that sort of a different habitat use profile for some of these more peripheral populations. And some of the biggest questions that still exist have to do with those sort of alternative habitat lifestyles that are out there, and why it would be so good to kind of broaden the amount of data that we can collect to understand all of these different variations.
Exactly. I think that's a well put answer.
Amy has a hand up.
I had some comments / questions on the partially on the feeder based flocks. In addition to seeing these in the PJ that I work in, we also have them through our neighborhood quite heavily on the east side of Flag, on the east side of the mountain. And they seem to go up and hang out in the Ponderosa a lot, and they're moving around the neighborhood. I think that question that someone else had about whether the flocks could be competing for feeders, though, is going to be really hard to answer with this kind of data, right? Because we don't know if these are two different, if there's two different flocks coming, or if it's just one. I think we've always assumed it's just one, and we see it making the rounds around the neighborhood. It goes. But knowing really for sure if there was one flock or two would be really indistinguishable with this kind of data, I think.
I think you're probably right that would be hard to directly distinguish. you might be able to infer that. For instance, if you looked at all of the data that were collected in the surrounding areas, and all of those points seemed to be within the typical home range of a flock, and there were no similar clusters of presence locations anywhere in the vicinity, you might guess that all of the birds visiting this feeder site within the home range or near the home range are from one flock. On the other hand, if you have kind of two distinct clusters of locations where birds are detected that might represent two different flocks, maybe it's two. But you're right, directly proving that with this kind of data would be difficult. But one of the powers of collecting as much data as you can in as many places as you can is that sometimes patterns will become clearer just sort of by brute force without really sophisticated ways of answering the question. So your observation is basically right, but over time we may be able to get more clarity on that with this kind of data.
Yeah. Some of the neighborhoods around Flagstaff might be good places to get that, because we could potentially with some recruiting effort, really get a whole bunch of observers to be watching.
And that sort of is something that I wanted to find a point in the presentation to mention to everybody. And we've talked about it to a few of you before, but as time goes by, we want everybody to start in this program doing the basics and get comfortable with that. But as time goes by, we'll be talking to different individuals and groups more about where opportunities might exist to use this approach to collecting data in a more targeted and designed way to answer specific questions. So that really is on the to-do list as this program grows and gets more mature. So, have that in the back of your mind as we get up and running with all of this. John B. Free mentions the radio telemetry we did out with his birds out in Eastern Nevada a number of years back, one of our very first Pinyon Jay projects at GBBO, and I remember that well too. So that was some good data we collected. So thank you for your help with that.
I'd like to hear more about the on-the-ground competition between Pinyon Jays and turkeys. But no, I think that's a great point about answering specific questions in different areas, because as we were sort of getting at with these variations within the range, this is going to ultimately inform more of our knowledge about the species and direct more questions. And we're going to generate more questions in the process of generating information, and those will be different in different areas. And so I really look forward to that, and some of the collaboration between these areas and talking about what people are seeing in the different parts of the range. I know I mentioned that Central Oregon Audubon chapter that joined recently. I know they've done a lot of work, and they have a lot of feeder-oriented birds up there, and they've been color banding individuals and sort of tracking them showing up at different locations. So be interested to hear some of his insight on that matter. So I think we've covered all the questions in the chat, and I see no hands raised. Oh, sounds like an entertaining show happening out front of John B. Free's place. But if no one has any more questions, I think we can wrap up tonight's session. Like I said before, I just want to make sure that everyone everyone gets as much as they can out of these sessions, and that's sort of the purpose of structuring them as these meetings. So if anyone has anything else, I would love to handle that. And if not, there are loads of resources on the Hub website, and you can always reach out to us at GBBO. And let me just type my email address into the chat for folks to. And
those of you who have, visited the Hub site on multiple locations in the past, it's been fairly static for a while, but some updates and new stuff and a regular cycle of new information really is coming soon. So keep checking back, and we'll announce when there are things there to look at. But our goal, as Ned said, our efforts to now have been mainly involved in sort of getting the basic structure done, getting everything up and running. But we want to make that as interactive and informative a location on the internet as it can be. And we're working hard to get that done. So give us a little more time to get that in place and check back, and we'll have some stuff for you to look at in the coming weeks and months.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. If there's no more questions, I'll go ahead and sign us off.
Okay.
Good night, all.
Everyone, thank you.
All right, thank you.